across the board that climate change is happening and that it's accelerating and that humans are the cause.
To quantify the impacts of climate change on the winter sport recreation industry, climate change could cost over $1 billion a year.
The more we can reduce emissions today, the more of winter we can preserve for our children.
These things are being made worse by climate change. The science is there. So we are no longer talking about the future. We are talking about the here and now.
Hey there, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's pretty stoked for y'all to be tuning in. My name is Zeppelin Zirup. I am a snowboarder from the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. And tonight I've got Stephen Handler from the U.S. Forest Service and Dr. Mark Flanner from the U of M joining me to talk a bit more about climate change and how it's impacting us throughout the Midwest and Michigan in particular. I think so often climate change is spoken about as a really global issue or only one in the Western states. But this is something we're seeing impact everyone everywhere. And we're excited to dive a bit deeper into the Midwest and talk about how it's affecting us at home here. So Stephen and Mark, if you guys would like to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Stephen Handler. I live in the big snow country in Houghton, Michigan, up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. Some of my favorite things to do outdoors. I love skiing, especially when I can convince my dog to pull me. That's the most fun you can have on two legs. I work for the U.S. Forest Service. And in particular, I work for a group called NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and I'm a climate change specialist.
And I'm Mark Flanner. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. I teach classes on climate change and radiative transfer. I enjoy skiing as well, very much, alpine touring especially. We've made a vow to get our children, our young daughters, into cross-country skiing this year. I also enjoy backpacking and photography and outdoor recreation.
And Stephen, you're a climate change specialist for the Forest Service. So tell me a bit more about your role and what that entails. You're in the Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the Houghton area. So talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, my position is kind of an interesting one in the Forest Service. I tell people I'm basically like a climate change phone a friend service. So if you are a landowner or a land manager, or if you just have questions about how climate change affects the natural world, my position is designed to help people think about climate change risks and how to adapt and prepare. So I work all across the lake states, mostly in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
What are some like the, I guess, most interesting questions you're seeing, or who is the average person calling you up and trying to learn or understand climate change locally?
Yeah, some of the most interesting things happening right now, I'd say, are that some of the large forest certification standards like FSC and SFI, you might be used to seeing those little logos on the envelopes that you buy, the paper products, the cardboard boxes. So those large certification bodies are now asking people, you know, if you are managing forest land, what's your strategy for responding to climate change? How are you thinking about that risk, and how are you adapting and preparing? And so that's been really fascinating to see. Now we're getting questions from the industrial side of the forestry community thinking about sustainability.
Yeah. That's wild. And Mark, you're a professor at the U of M, so really passing down your knowledge to the next generation. It sounds like you've got an entire class of undergrads in a climate change course right now. Can you tell me a bit more about that and, you know, what you're covering with them?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the courses that I teach are small and specialized for our majors, very technical, but sometimes I have the opportunity to teach these large undergraduate courses for non-science majors. I'm doing that right now. There are 250 students in this course, and they come from all different majors and colleges and sides of the campus. We've got performance music majors, athletes, and it really indicates that there's large interest in climate change and in learning about it and what it means for our future.
And what are you doing in terms of your own research outside of teaching?
Yeah, so my research has sort of three legs to it. One is about cryospheric sciences. So cryosphere is Earth's frozen water. It includes snow on land. It also includes sea ice. It includes glacial ice too, and the large ice sheets like on Greenland and Antarctica. I also study how radiation moves through the atmosphere, how sunlight interacts with little particles that humans put into the atmosphere, and also how Earth's heat escapes out to space. That's the second leg of my research. And the third leg is about those particles. We call them aerosols, and what causes them to go into the atmosphere and how they influence climate.
What would you say is the most like exciting or intriguing or almost scary thing that you've found in your research in the past decade or so? Like, what are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I guess one thing related to my own work is we've discovered that an aerosol, and this involves many collaborators across the world, one component of these aerosol particles is soot, black carbon. It comes out of coal combustion, diesel combustion, wildfires. And it's a unique aerosol because it absorbs sunlight. And because it absorbs sunlight, it heats the atmosphere. And we believe this is probably the second, but definitely the second or third largest contributor to global warming after carbon dioxide, largest human-caused contributor to global warming.
And was that a new discovery from your research team, or are there multiple groups working on that?
Yeah, so this is a large collaborative effort that has involved hundreds of scientists, and we always knew that soot warmed the climate, but in recent years, it's become clear that it's maybe a stronger contributor to warming than previously thought. What's complicated is that it's co-emitted with other species that cool the climate, these aerosol particles that scatter sunlight back to space. And so climate mitigation opportunities will necessarily focus on those sources that put a lot of this warming stuff into the atmosphere and not so much of the cooling stuff.
So Stephen, since you're with the Forest Service and we're having historic wildfires throughout the West, is that conversation about soot more prevalent in your day-to-day right now with what's going on?
Well, we do hear about those kind of feedbacks from wildfire to other natural ecosystems. So you hear about, probably all of us around the country, no matter where you are, you're starting to see the smoke in the air from these Western wildfires, or maybe you've already been seeing it for a while now. So that stuff settles down somewhere, and if it's settling on snow, that can kind of further accelerate the melting of snow that we would hope would last through the year, or at least through most of the summer, to provide, consistent stream flow. And so if you're speeding up that snow melting because of forest fire deposits, that's kind of an accelerating cycle.
Yeah, and if anyone has seen the intensely red sunsets this week or last week in Michigan, those are caused by wildfires out on the West Coast.
Okay, so switching it up a little, you're on a chairlift or you're on a trail and you've got 3 minutes to explain climate change or climate science to someone. If we're talking about Michigan, that might be a 15-minute chairlift, but let's keep it quick and dirty. How would you explain climate change and climate science to someone who doesn't know so much?
Sure, I guess, in terms of, I guess there's a few things I would point out. I mean, one, we certainly know that when we add any gas to our atmosphere that absorbs infrared radiation, the type of heat that Earth gives off, that will necessarily warm the surface. Secondly, we know that the increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been caused by human activity. The increases from year to year very closely align with the amount of burning of fossil fuels that we have. And you can see that in years when economic activity goes down, like during the Great Recession, during the collapse of the Soviet Union, the growth rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been lower. It will certainly be lower this year. We'll have to wait and see what the final numbers are. I would also point out that the isotopic signature, the signature of CO2, there's different flavors of carbon atoms, and the flavors that we've been observing that have been increasing in the atmosphere look a lot like dead carbon, radiocarbon with no radiocarbon. So they look a lot like fossil fuel. And we also know that the planet's been warming. That's very clear in the instrumental record. We see ice sheets and glaciers melting. And so this all is kind of a self-consistent picture with anthropogenic warming. And the last point I would make is that climate models, there's no climate model that can reproduce the observed warming over the last 150 years that doesn't include the human influence, that doesn't include the increase in carbon dioxide and also these aerosol particles that I talked about earlier.
Stephen, have you got anything to add to that?
Oftentimes I get to a point in a discussion when I'm explaining climate change to someone or maybe a whole audience of skeptical folks. Oftentimes the question comes up, well, the climate's always changed throughout the Earth's history. Change is the only constant. And so why worry now? And I guess a couple of things that are different about the change that we're seeing now, and why you can't just write it off as part of the Earth's natural processes are, number one, like Mark just said, we know that it's us this time. It's not just natural fluctuations. We're actually driving this change. Secondly, it's changing a lot faster now. The rate of change is really alarming. And third, and probably one that's easy to forget, but it didn't matter to us how the Earth's climate changed hundreds of thousands of years ago. Today, we have our whole society and our economy and our way of life structured around a stable climate and the expectation of a stable climate. And so as things are changing, that's going to cause our society some pain and some stress. And we have to admit that.
I like that, how it truly didn't matter before, but now the human element and our dependency on a consistent climate is so intense that it does matter. Quick call out for any audience members out there who may have questions. We'll be doing a Q&A after we wrap up. So if you have any questions for myself or Mark or Stephen, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pull them up at the end and run through them. So, yeah, my next question is really, how are we seeing this, how are you seeing the impacts of climate change in the Midwest? And I'm young, but I've seen it pretty dramatically even since I was growing up, with annual snowfall, more rain, higher lake levels. So tell me a bit more about that from the actual science side. What are you seeing?
Well,
Sure. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, when I talk to people about climate change, and if I have to boil it down, I usually talk about two main headlines, kind of the top level impacts that we're seeing in the Midwest. And the first of those is that our winters are warming rapidly, like you just mentioned. Winter's really where most of the action has been in terms of the season that's changing the fastest and most noticeably. So that's the first. But the second, and many of us have already lived through this second one as well, is that more of our precipitation is being delivered in these big, heavy rain events, 4 inches at a time, 6 inches at a time, 10 inches at a time. Those used to be thought of as something that would occur once every 500 years, once every 1,000 years. And now we're seeing multiple of those events occurring within the last several years. There's places in northern Wisconsin, not far from where I live, that have been hit by 2 500-year floods in a period of 3 years. And so that really causes you to take a step back and say, gosh, how much of this is the new normal?
Yeah, I would maybe just add to that too, that as Steve said, we're seeing warmer winters. We're also seeing wetter winters. And in some places that actually translates into more snowfall in areas that are cold enough to support solid precipitation. But we're seeing shorter winters too. And so the snow is melting earlier in the springtime. And on top of that, we're seeing rather strong spring rainfall events. And that's a recipe for flooding that occurs in the spring and early summer. We've definitely been seeing that in recent years.
Last time I was home, the lake levels in Lake Michigan and all throughout the Great Lakes was at 100-year highs. Do you attribute that at all to climate change and that increase in rain events?
Yeah, lake levels, Mark, I'm sure you jump in on this too, but we've seen pretty rapid fluctuations in Great Lakes lake levels in the past 20 years. We've been at periods of dramatic lows, and now we're in this period of dramatic highs, record highs. Certainly there's a connection when you get these 10-inch rainfall events. That water has to go somewhere, and there's only constricted outflows of the Great Lakes to disperse that water. So depending on where those big rain events hit and what the annual precipitation is like, certainly that's caused some of the uptick in our recent lake levels. But it also has to do with ice cover throughout the year and many factors like that.
Yep. Yeah, I would add temperature is a big factor with lake levels too. It controls the rate of evaporation. So what controls lake levels is just what goes in minus what goes out. And what goes in is anything that rains or snows on the lakes and anything that runs off from the surrounding area, the Great Lakes Basin. The amount of runoff that flows into the Great Lakes depends on how quickly and intensely the events come, as Steve was just saying. And we are seeming to see more intense rainfall events. And then what goes out? Evaporation, and that's strongly determined by temperature. We're certainly seeing warmer temperatures in the Great Lakes area, including in summertime when you get a lot of evaporation. So there are complex factors at play for lake levels. The sea ice tends to keep a lid on evaporation during winter and spring. And we're seeing unusual conditions. And I think that's contributing to the wild oscillations that we're seeing in lake levels, going from near record lows at the beginning of this decade to near record highs currently. We're seeing more unusual weather patterns that we're not accustomed to seeing.
And how do you think that's going to continue impacting us moving forward? Obviously, we're seeing really the first wave of, I think, implications of the changing climate. What do the next 50 to 100 years look like, both on a national level and at home in the Midwest? Let you both take a swing at this one.
All right. Steve, do you want to go first or you want me to go first?
You take this one.
All right. So when we try to understand climate in the future, we run global climate models and we run them with different scenarios of emissions. So the biggest source of uncertainty in future climate is actually what humans do, what we put into the atmosphere, how much carbon we put into the atmosphere. But among these climate simulations, there are some robust signals or features that pop out. And there are some areas that that models universally show will become drier or wetter. Almost everywhere it gets warmer. That's kind of intuitive. And some areas that we're pretty sure will get drier include the Southwest United States and these areas of the subtropics. So outside of the tropical rainfall area, but equatorward of where we live here in the Midwest, those areas will very likely get drier. In Michigan, the Midwest, we're in a bit of a gray zone, and there's less convergence in what models are showing will happen. But there is kind of a tendency for models to indicate that this part of the world will get rainier, so more precipitation falling. Does that translate into moister soil? Not necessarily. Temperature is a big factor in determining evaporation rates from soil. And so people tend to think of drought as just being rainfall or no rainfall, but temperature is a really important factor. We saw that with the California droughts recently. The big droughts recently were associated more with hotter temperatures than with lower precipitation. And so although rainfall was low, it wasn't record-breaking low rainfall amounts. What was unusual was the warm temperatures, and that led to more evaporation, which dried the soils. So despite seeing more precipitation in this part of the world, we could still see drier soil conditions in the future. That's actually a prediction of these models. And then finally, what was mentioned earlier was that the rainfall will likely come in fewer and more intense events. And so that has big implications for runoff into the lakes and for agricultural viability too in this part of the world.
Yeah, and I guess just to connect that to some of the ways we relate to the outdoors in the Midwest, there's already been long-term trends of less time of reliable ice on our lakes in the winter. So a study in Canada, actually, our neighbor to the north, has shown that they're already documenting a decline in the lake ice season where you can reliably skate, play hockey. They're losing 1 to 5 days each decade over the past several decades of that reliable ice season. And then you spin this out into the future, and there are projections that most of our lakes in the Midwest will shift from having reliable annual winter ice to being more of an intermittent winter ice condition. So the things that we have always grown up, relying on and kind of assuming are part of our identity of the Midwest. You talk about playing Canada or playing hockey in Canada. If they're talking about sacrificing outdoor pond hockey, that's a big part of their identity that is at risk now, if these conditions continue.
Sure. Yeah, I would add ice fishing to that list too. We assume you can just go out onto the lake in late January, and that might not be a slam dunk in the future. You can reliably and safely go out onto the ice in Michigan.
Okay, so in Michigan, as much as any other state, but in particular Michigan, just need to do a call out to POW's voter registration platform. So makeadamplan.org, makeadamplan.org, to make a plan to vote. Our studies, there it is for you. You can click the link right there, but that just show how much the voter turnout increases when you have an actual plan to show up to the polls, whether that's absentee or mail-in or actually showing up in person, and especially in Michigan, where the presidential election in 2016 was by only 11,000 votes. That is almost nothing in the scheme of things. And that one state, Michigan, could have flipped the Electoral College. Who knows? So please encourage your friends and family to vote. And then one more thing, after we wrap up the Q&A with Stephen and Mark, I'll be showing a film of mine called Made in the Mitten that really chronicles the history of snurfing and how snurfing was invented in Michigan and in Muskegon. And Jake Burton came and really took it to snowboarding by adding a binding. So it'll be coming out with Burton this fall, but this will be a special sneak peek for Protect Our Winters members. I'm excited to share that with you. But now we'll dive into a few Q&As. Questions from the audience. And all right, from Virginia, we'll start with our first one. While climate change deniers are becoming more scarce, the new argument is that it isn't from humans. How can I explain that we understand that it actually attributed to humans?
I can take a stab at that. I guess I'd go back to some of the arguments I presented earlier, one of which is that no climate model simulation can reproduce the warming that has been observed without putting the human contributions into the model. And those human contributions include carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, and the aerosol emissions and also land use change, which changes the reflectivity of the planet. So, if the shoe fits the foot, it's kind of the likely explanation there. And then we know unambiguously that the added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is caused by human activity. That's also a slam dunk. And so we can compare the energy forcing from carbon dioxide with the energy forcing from natural effects like changes in the sun or volcanic emissions, and the energy forcing to Earth from carbon dioxide increases is about tenfold that of energy increase from the sun changes that have occurred over the last 50 years or so. So just from an energy level too, there's just a huge discrepancy there. Those are the main arguments that I would use.
Okay, this next one is for Stephen from Bailey. What advice do you have for those of us that get the question, yeah, but we had a great winter, so there's no such thing as climate change? I think that's a thing I hear often, so I'm excited to hear how you would respond to that.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago, 2013, 2014, and 2014, 2015, everyone was talking about the polar vortex, right? And we had these really impressive winters, record-breaking snowfall up in the Keweenaw. And you better believe I heard from people about that. What do you have to say about climate change now? Look at the weather outside. Number one, we always have to separate those two ideas, weather and climate. Weather is what we see day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Even when you look at what's happening over a decade, really what you're experiencing is just random chance and chaos, right? So we get a polar vortex that really slams us through winter one year. The next winter, we get record-breaking warm temperatures. So you can't be distracted by that ping pong and that chaos in the short term. Climate is what plays out over multiple decades. So we're talking about the long-term trend when we say climate change. So that's the first answer, is that you're only really talking about climate when you're looking at 30 years or more. Okay, so go show me a chart of winter temperatures that shows them decreasing over 30 years. You can't do it.
Yeah, Mark Twain summed it up. He said, "Weather is what we get, and climate is weather is what we get, and climate is what we expect."
So this one's from Andrew, Midwest specific. What are some of the biggest issues we should work on when it comes to climate change in the Midwest? He mentioned the sulfide ore copper mining around the boundary waters, but what are some of the other localized climate issues that we should know about or get actively involved and engaged on?
Well, in the Midwest, compared to other parts of the country, we do still have a pretty high proportion of our energy mix that is from dirty and old sources of energy. We still have plenty of coal generation and natural gas generation. So I think that's far and away the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in terms of getting the most bang from your buck of places to focus. But then, if you look at where to put your energy, something I always come back to is, yes, put your energy on reducing the rate of climate change. But then also we have to start paying attention to how do we adapt and prepare. And that starts with paying attention to the people and the places that are most at risk and who are going to be impacted most severely by change. And that starts with frontline communities, poor communities, indigenous communities, anyone who's been marginalized in other walks of life is probably also being marginalized when it comes to bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. And so that's also a great place to put your energy, is making sure there's some equity in how we're responding and adapting.
I appreciate that. I think it's often easy to forget that those frontline communities are going to bear their brunt, and some of us may have the option to move, and others may not. You know, it's like the Coast Range or the coastal communities of the American Southeast that are being hit so hard by these hurricanes. They don't simply have the option to move inland, move to a different city. So to not forget about that preparation when they're having this conversation is huge. This one is also for you, Stephen, from Zoe. Is there a similar rate of change in the environment between the upper and lower peninsulas of Michigan? Obviously, pretty different climates, one being much colder, but are you seeing any difference there in the more northerly regions?
So we'd have to check the map on this to see how much difference the rate of change is across Michigan. Mark, maybe you have this already in the back of your head, but the general rule of thumb is northerly places are warming faster. Places that are historically cold are warming faster. So that, you know, that tends to make me think the UP is probably experiencing faster warming than the lower peninsula.
Yeah, that's an excellent mantra. I don't have the data off the top of my head. I do know that the precipitation changes in the UP have been rather extreme and more extreme than in the lower peninsula and in Wisconsin.
Okay, and I'm pulling this one straight from the audience chat, not in the admin chat, because I like it. If you two were crowned king of the world, what were the top 3 things that you would do to curb the effects of climate change on a global scale?
Mark, you want to go first?
My number 1 would be to implement a carbon tax. I believe that would accelerate transition to a low carbon economy in ways that we just can't even imagine. It would bring out entrepreneurial spirits. There would just be a double incentive. The individual would have an incentive to reduce their carbon emission. You could redistribute this tax evenly. We'd hope that the government doesn't make money off of it. You could redistribute the money to the people so that there would be an incentive to use less carbon. And then among entrepreneurs, engineers, there would be an incentive to accelerate the development of technologies that are low carbon. That would be my number 1. Maybe I'll see if Steve wants to add something.
You got my number 1. We're going to have to be competing kings. Yep, that's a great one. I guess I'll do my number 2 then. I would. So we, as a society, whether we know it or not, we already have our thumb on the scale in terms of which energy sources we prefer, because a lot of this is baked into how we subsidize different industries at our federal government level, at our state government level, even locally. And so across the board, I think it's worth evaluating all of those subsidies and that distribution of subsidies and taking it away from fossil fuels and putting it towards research and development, alternative energy, clean energy, and adaptation. So resetting the subsidy game, I think, would be my number 2.
All right. Mark, have you got anything else to add, or we'll go into the last question for the evening?
Go ahead into the last question.
How do you talk about climate change to your students, and do you find them enthusiastic about working for solutions, or overwhelmed? So, and really, what advice do you have for this next generation coming up that's going to be carrying the weight of dealing with this issue for the next 50 years?
Yeah, great question. I do see them as being enthusiastic, but also concerned. And it's part of maybe a broader trend that's driving anxiety among our younger generation for understandable reasons. One interesting thing is that I feel that the students now accept the reality of climate change more than they did a decade ago when I started teaching at the University of Michigan. And so they actually are more interested in finding solutions in an almost impatient way. I don't feel that we even need to discuss the reality of climate change anymore like I used to a decade ago. It's accepted, and students want to know how to solve it. And that's the hard part.
All right, I lied. We're actually going to do one more. for Stephen. What is your biggest motivation to continue this work, especially given, the devastating impacts on the things we all love to do, and what makes you hopeful for the future?
So in my work, I help people think about managing and protecting the places they love and the resources that they care about, whether it's forests, wildlife habitat, clean water, recreational opportunities. I deal with indigenous communities and thinking about how to maintain their cultural practices and cultural values. So that's part of what keeps me hopeful, is that I'm constantly reminded about the value that we get from our natural world and from healthy ecosystems and healthy places. And so it's worth it. That's the main thing, is that you realize there are so many things that are worth fighting for. And the second thing is something that Mark mentioned earlier, is that our future is not set in stone yet. There's still a huge range of possible outcomes when it comes to climate change. And we can claw and scratch and fight and do everything we can to get to the low end of the future climate projections with choices we make today and over the next couple of years. And we will be so thankful we did that. Believe me, if you've looked at the difference between the high end and the low end of those climate maps, man, we got to do everything we can to get to the low end of that bracket.
Mark, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I couldn't put it better myself.
Okay. Is there any way that people can follow your work or get in touch with you that you would like to share?
Yeah.
I've got a homepage through the university Twitter account, Steve.
Yeah, if you're interested in our work in the natural world and thinking about how we respond to change and assess risk, our group is called NIACS, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. You can find us at niacs.org.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Stephen and Mark, for sharing your knowledge with us this afternoon. Seriously appreciated. I'll do one last ask for everyone to visit makeadamplan.org and make a plan to vote if you are not already registered to vote. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. If you want to stick around, we're going to show Made in the Mitten. It's 7 minutes long, and I hope you love it. So thanks again for coming out.
Yep, looking forward to it. Thanks for having us.
See ya.
We're rolling, so we're gonna clap. Ready? Okay, show them one, take one.
But this brings up a very interesting story. You haven't asked me the question, where did snowboarding come from? And I'll answer that question. It was December 25th, 1965. We had had a huge snowstorm on the shores of Lake Michigan. My wife, she came in the living room and said, "Sherm, you got to get these kids out of the house and do something. Necessity is the mother of invention." And I looked over and I saw my oldest daughter, Wendy's little 32-inch skis from Kmart. So I put these two little skis together and braced them. Well, I packed them up, we went outside, and it was all during this episode. I wish I could explain how these thoughts come, but I said, my gosh, we're surfing. We're surfing, and if you could get back up this hill, it's really a wave, and you could surf it all day long. My wife had dreamed up the contraction of the words snow and surf for snurfer. as it says in my patent, a downhill device where the rider travels perpendicular to the direction of travel. And then the neighborhood kids came in, they wanted to play on it. They absolutely had a ball. What I really saw developing was a toy to replace the sled. As it progressed, Muskegon is the home of Brunswick Corporation, where they make bowling alleys, bowling pins, bowling balls, and all. And I had 2 or 3 really good friends, engineers that worked there. And Brunswick wanted to get their hands on it before anybody else did. That's how the thing went to market. They were advertising this Snurfer as a winter skateboard. The skateboard culture was really booming, and it was a counterculture.
It was 1968 when we got our first Snurfer, so we were 10. So
that's kind of where it all started. I think this Snurfing became quite popular. About that time, all our friends were getting Snurfers as well, and we just did a lot of backwoodsing. And then along came the contest.
Snurfing is adaptable to all age groups for play or for sport. All these people in the national contest purchased their Snurfers from retail stores in their hometown. Then they carried them home to practice on hills and slopes. And soon, they were ready for competition.
The hill was a challenge. Very few people made it to the bottom. If you made it, you probably won.
Yeah.
Owning your own Snurfer means you are eligible to join the National Snurfing Association. You receive a beautiful woven patch to wear on sweaters or jackets.
Nobody really had any type of a surfboard for the snow until Sherman Poppins invented Snurfer. That was the start, and it went from Snurfing contest to snow surfing contest to snowboarding. That changed the game.
Very good. Finding wasn't even on all the way.
In 1979, now this is 14 years after the patents were on, Jake Burton Carpenter came to the contest, and Jake brought Snurfers, but he had cut an inner tube and made a thing to slip your foot under and nailed it to the Snurfer. So in effect, he had a little binding. Well, that was pretty important.
A company called with Brunswick Corporation used to make something called a Snurfer a long time ago, and I rode those for about the last 10 years, and nobody really improved it. And living back east and just sort of getting flustered with that particular board, just decided to start making something on my own. Front foot goes in this binding right here, and then your back foot tucks underneath this back binding. It's a real good sport. I hope everybody gets into it because it's pretty safe, it's a lot of fun, there's a lot of speed, and you can definitely surf the snow.
It's a great sport. More people ought to do it.
I'll tell you, if anybody deserves credit for the whole industry other than my little board, it's Jake Burton Carpenter. He saw the future that I didn't see. It's become a commodity now, but still, I think there's a lot of people riding who are riding because of that feeling and that emotion. Any rider today will tell you that a snowboard and powder is about one of the greatest experiences you could have. Well, it was the same on the Snurfer. If you can get in deep snow and you know what you're doing, there's nothing like it. I mean, it's just fantastic. I rode alone a lot. There was something, well, I call it zen. You felt it when you made a good turn and when you got the right amount of air. It's still exciting and it's still romantic.
When you're